Good evening, class, or at least it is good evening for me right now. So welcome to today's installment. The time period 1754 to 1800. There's several key areas during this period. I put some key questions here for our economic discussion. The first is, were the economic conditions imposed by Parliament on the colonists enough to justify declaring independence? Then, to what extent were the Articles of Confederation an effective form of government? And lastly, the one I'm most interested in seeing how well you can do in class with is, how successful was Alexander Hamilton's financial plan? So I'm going to do my best to make this as brief as possible. I'm not sure how long it's going to last, but of course all of this information would require more than one class period. Please keep in mind that from let's see if I can get the pen to work. Very good. 1754 to 1763. That is your French and Indian War, in which the British and the colonists were on the same side. From 1763 to 1776, those are your causes of the revolution. And I will eventually get handwriting as legible, as neat, as impressive as the Khan Academy. It's going to take me a long time. 1776 is our Declaration of Independence. 1776 to 1783 is the American Revolution. Then I'm going to overlap a little bit. 1781 to 1789. Now let's make that 7, I apologize. Will be your Articles of Confederation. 1787 to 1789 will be the Constitutional Era. And then 1789 to 1800 will be what they often refer to as the Early Republic. So a lot of major changes and important concepts and time period events during this time period. So let's start with the significance of the French and Indian War. And for our purposes, since we're doing work, exchange, and technology, we're focused on the economics, this man, and the pen, I guess I have to click on it again, but this man, William Pitt, who was the Prime Minister, at one point made a deal, an official deal, with the colonists. And he said during the French and Indian War that if they enlist, if they fight in the war, I'm getting carried away with the pen now, but if they fight in the war, that he will make sure that Parliament pays the cost of the war. And that's a key fact to remember as to why so many colonists were angered by the next stage of events, because as soon as the English and the colonists were victorious in the French and Indian War, then you will see a whole, I really do have to work on this, you will see a whole host of new taxes that are going to take place in the colonies. So you are going to see a sugar act, and this will be obviously a tax on sugar. Then there will be a stamp act, and the stamp act is going to require colonists to pay for all legal documents and marriage licenses and playing cards and newspapers. This was the first internal tax that hit the colonists, and that bothered them extremely, because they were being forced now to pay for something that they were producing within their in their colonies. And also try to keep in mind, the upper class people who were writing, publishing, now they're being hit, and this is another group that's going to be further alienated by Parliament's actions. You're going to see, you will see the Stamp Act repealed, but the repeal of the Stamp Act will lead to something called the Declaratory Act, which basically lets the Parliament do whatever it wants to the colonists. It's the exact words are "in all cases whatsoever." So the colonists who were boycotting the Stamp Act, who were tarring and feathering stamp collectors, are in a celebratory mood because they were able to get that repealed, but it was just replaced with something that gave Parliament even more authority. Then you're going to see the Townshend Acts, and the Townshend Acts will be taxes on paper, paint, lead, glass, and then the one you're probably most familiar with, and that's tea. All the other ones I just listed, lead, paper, paint, and glass, those will eventually be repealed, but the tea is the one that will lead to the 1773 Boston Tea Party. And I'll try to explain this fairly well. Well, I'll try much better than that. The East India Company was suffering financially. So Parliament, in an attempt to try to boost up the profits of this company, decided to give them certain tax exemptions, but also preferential treatment with the sale of tea to the colonies. And they even lowered the cost of the tea. Sometimes this is hard for people to understand. If you have smuggled tea, which is breaking the law, versus the British East India Company, the smuggled tea was the more expensive of the two. Yet, it was more the principle that upset and infuriated the colonists as much as it did. And they just refused on principle to buy from the British East India Company. So the Boston Tea Party is when they dumped 342 chests of tea into Boston Harbor. They were disguised as Native Americans, and this incredibly, I would say, significant event led to just tensions that really, at this point, there was no going back. I will just point out overall, and we're going to have a discussion about this on Monday, and this is somewhat biased, the colonists versus the British citizens. Colonist taxes were 1/16 the rate of the British. And this was actually brought to my attention several years ago by a student who really was extremely pro-British in the discussion, as on the topic of whether or not the revolution was justified. So just keep that in mind for now. In addition to all of this, during the Revolutionary War, pre-revolution, I apologize, there's going to be the whole concept of taxation without representation. And I want everybody to understand that the British argument was that you are represented, colonies. We have a representative body, and therefore, because we have that, virtually you are represented. The colonists, on the other hand, chanted no taxation without representation, and that's simply because they felt that laws were being passed for them without any member of the colonies sitting in Parliament. Of course, there was an ocean separating them, and it was the 1700s, but this becomes the philosophical debate that takes place during this era. Again, we are focusing more just on the economic significance of the revolution, and that's why I focused on the various taxes that were imposed on them and the Boston Tea Party. Now, once the revolution is successful, the first form of government is going to be the Articles of Confederation. And the key aspect of this that you want to remember, I think I'll ever remember that I have to do this, the key aspect is that this was a weak central government. Okay? Power largely resided with the states. They had just gotten finished breaking away from a central authority that they were not pleased with. They were not about, the colonists, now Americans, were not about to give more authority to a central body. So there's Articles of Confederation, and you can see this in the notes. There is no military. There is no chief executive. There is no Supreme Court. There is no power to tax. All the colonists can do, all the government can do is request money. There is no uniform currency. Each state could have and print its own currency. There would be a need for 9 states out of 13 to pass a law. And they would need all 13. They would need a unanimous vote to pass an amendment to the Articles. So the weaknesses are pretty prevalent. Later I will talk to you about a rebellion in Massachusetts called Shays' Rebellion that shows how weak it was without that military to suppress a violent uprising. But again, we want to focus on the economic aspects of it. And there is an argument that could be made that some elements of the Articles would be useful today. One person in particular who would make that argument would be this man. Did it again. Would be this man. And his name, some of you are saying it right now, is Rand Paul. Again, this is today. Rand Paul is largely in favor of a states' rights document. Now, some of you might know who this man is. This is just a little fact tidbit that I like to play around with and have some fun. The Articles of Confederation did not allow for a chief executive. However, someone must be in charge. So because there was a one-house legislature, there was a one-house Congress, the man who was in charge of the Congress, and the first president technically, if we're cheating, is John Hanson. Again, I didn't make this up. This is real. So if you even just search the first president, Google, sometimes John Hanson appears right away. I once had a very, just a spectacular student who brought to my attention the next day that there were actually people before John Hanson. I think they may have given me the name Samuel Huntington. And that's because John Hanson is the first president. As soon as the treaty ending the revolution was officially ratified, that's when he becomes the first president. But I think I'm probably boring you with those little tidbits. We will talk about whether or not the Articles of Confederation would be that there are aspects of it that could be useful for us today. And then I will finish with Alexander Hamilton's financial plan. So who is this Alexander Hamilton? He was the first Secretary of the Treasury. And appointed by George Washington, Alexander Hamilton felt the need to review all of the conditions economically in this brand new country that we have. Remember, our economy was not stable at this time. There were many problems that were brought upon us, and we were fragile. There was no guarantee that America, the strong country that you know of today, was going to be successful. So after he laid, just kind of figured out the whole groundwork of the economy, he devised, and he was brilliant, graduated King's College, which is Columbia, at a very young age, but he developed a 5-part plan. And I'm going to finish up by trying to explain to you these 5 parts. Now, the first part is the consolidation of all debts. And this is usually the part that students struggle with. That's why I'm going to explain it here as well as in face-to-face in class. Instead of having different states that owed money, instead of having some people who owned bonds and others who didn't, and different types of bonds, and I hope you understand that when you have a bond from the government, technically the government owes you money, so it's a debt for the government. Hamilton says, let's consolidate all of our debts. And let's do that by paying people face value for their bonds. So while the money doesn't, compare back then to today, if you have a $100 bond, he was willing to give you full value for that. That doesn't always happen. So he was trying to make everything consolidated so that we could create one national debt. And by having one national debt, it helps to unify the country so we can work together and pay this debt off. Now, I'm sure some people still don't understand what I'm saying about the bonds. Here's another good explanation for you. During the Revolution, and even during the Articles, if people were poor and they owned these bonds, they would have to sell them to get something for the bond. They were not getting face value. Now you have wealthy people who have kept their bonds, and they will get face value. So critics of Hamilton's plan contended that what he was doing is favoring the rich. He would counter that by saying, I'm not favoring the rich, I just need to unify this country. And it's good to have wealthy people who help establish the economic foundation. So that's the big debate about the bonds. I have no problem explaining it to you again in class. All right, where are we going to put all this money? We're going to put it in a national bank that he wants to create. The national bank would be 80% private and 20% public. And the national bank will cause tremendous controversy with the Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson, who believed that the bank could not be created because it wasn't in the Constitution. Hamilton, interpreting the Constitution loosely, said that it doesn't say we can't create a national bank. Now, here's why this man is so brilliant. He has now consolidated a debt and now is going to pay that debt off. And how will he raise money? With an excise tax on whiskey, which will also bring up some controversy. But he believed that an excise tax, a tax on this item, would contribute to us paying off this one national debt. And finally, he believes in a protective tariff. So, we are going to try to impose taxes on foreign goods, which will not only help us to raise money, it will also contribute to the manufacturing in America, because people will be more encouraged to buy our goods without that extra tax. This is Hamilton's plan. It's very complicated. It is not particularly easy for everybody to remember. But I will tell you that to get this plan approved, he did have to make a compromise. And if you go back to this part one, the consolidation of all debts, some states did not have any debt. They did not incur debt during the Revolution. Many of those states happened to be in the South. And they didn't understand why they had to pay for the debts of northern states. So Hamilton made a deal. And that deal was that he would take the capital of the United States and he would move it from New York to the Potomac River, which will eventually become Washington, D.C. Temporarily, while they were building Washington, D.C., the capital was in Philadelphia. And this is how we eventually get down to the area between Virginia and Maryland. So there's an awful lot there. I decided this weekend I just wanted to give you an overview of the whole time period, and then I can do some more lessons with plenty of explanation in class, so I don't want anybody to worry about it. I also am kind of disgusted with the lack of real professional look of my PowerPoints and videos, but I just know that it's going to be, I'm going to get to that point, I really promise. Okay, so thank you very much for listening, and let's now see if I have the ability to press stop as soon as possible.